Good evening, good afternoon. Welcome back to High Top Sports Oregon. I am Cody the Professor. We got Derek the Duck right after National Signing Day mayhem. I guess they still call it that. They're not signing letter of intents or signing contracts, NIL deals. Some kids are rolling up in Lamborghinis and thanking Miami boosters. Thanks for everything you gave me with fresh chains on. I don't know. I just did 9 hours live today on the High Top channel, so a little frazzled. But Dan Lanning and the Ducks go absolutely berserk in recruiting. But first, I want to thank our proud sponsor, BetUS. Go ahead, check them out, betus.com. They've been sponsoring us this entire season. We are so grateful on all the high top programs for BetUS. Derek, number 4. I don't know if it breaks the record from last year, but it felt like the hot team this year was either 1 Texas or 2 Oregon. If you were in head-to-head battles with those two, you are losing. As a Florida fan, I lost today with Dallas Wilson. Obviously, that sucks bad. Even Ohio State got a little berated by a couple programs. LSU lost almost the depth of their class to Michigan and others. Alabama went and pillaged them. So, wild day. But let's go ahead and get into the Ducks. How you feeling as a Duck fan? I called you about 9:30 this morning. There was a little smoke and mirrors apparently about Dallas Wilson. Let's go over that play-by-play.
Yeah, man. Dallas Wilson's recruitment down the stretch has been one of the more intriguing storylines, not even just for Oregon and Florida, just in general. I think, as a Florida guy, you've been able to see over the past couple of weeks just the fluidity that has happened with his recruitment in general. We were just talking about he's been committed for almost 2 full calendar years to Oregon. And obviously, the in-state programs, the Miamis, the Floridas, even the Florida States, they were pulling on his strings the entire way. But I'm going to be honest, yeah, I was getting a little nervous down the stretch. There were when you start seeing Fong bombs drop in for Florida to flip a guy, it's you're usually not very confident about where you're sitting at that point. But it was most definitely a wild ride. It didn't help that I got a call from the prof on live this morning, trying to give me shit, telling me that Dallas was going to sign with the Gators. You had me really nervous at that point. I had to play it pretty cool, but I was a little nervous. But yeah, ultimately he ended up signing with the Ducks, obviously. But it's just so strange to me because, like we were talking about before the cast, it sounds like he told 2 different programs that, hey, I'm going to be signing with you today. And then, obviously here we are. He ended up putting the pen to the paper with the Ducks. But, from a Gators perspective, I could see how that one stung a little bit just because, like you said, the paperwork had started to been filed for Florida.
Yeah, so we have somebody inside the program with High Top, and from everything we heard, Dallas Wilson did get a extremely serious offer. Was told early that late last night at 10:30, 11 o'clock. He's coming to Florida this morning. Reassures us. Actually, Miami, I think, was the first insider to drop that he was flipping to Florida. They called him for a bid last minute. He said, "Nah, I'm going to Florida. I'm good on it." And just all of a sudden, it just dried up. Like 30 minutes before him actually going on it seemed like things started getting a little shaky. Listen, these are 18-year-old kids getting a exuberant amount of offers to likes of money that me and Derek and Shelton have never probably seen thrown in our lap, right? And so I don't blame the kid, but it kind of just sucks that he told 2 programs that. But that's recruiting at the end of the day. I'm sure there's for this happening to us against Oregon, I'm sure there's 90 other kids that did the same thing today, just not so high profile.
Yeah, 100%. And it's kind of like we were talking about. This is what makes early signing day so fun. I guess I shouldn't even call it that. I know it's early signing period now because we got the 3-day period here. But this is what makes signing day so fun, right? It's the ebbs and the flows of it. For a fact, come signing day, you're gonna have those couple handful of guys where you're like, are they gonna stick with the recruitment? Are they gonna stick with their commitment? And then obviously you have the guys at the end of the day like Jaron, excuse me, we're still learning his last name, KS, the 5-star out of Hawaii. He was kind of one that went the other way, where toward the end it sounded like he was going to end up sticking it out with Cal, ended up flipping last minute. But that's what makes signing day so fun for Gator fans. You guys got to see a plethora of flips, so not even today, just over the last week in general. I
14
mean, obviously
flips.
Oregon 14 flavor, and that's what makes it interesting, right? That's the name of the game in recruiting right now. And it's same thing with Gavin Nix. He had just flipped his commitment from Miami to Oregon last minute. Ended up signing today. Naheem Offord, obviously, that's another pretty high profile guy that a lot of people were keeping an eye on. And Oregon
Which
had actually faded.
we talked
Yeah,
about
he
him
had actually.
very, very early in
Mhm.
this. And then it just felt
Yeah,
like it dried up.
and that's kind of the word that we are getting to, is that it seemed like there was a lot of smoke toward Auburn, obviously, over the last month in particular. It seemed like, not even Oregon insiders, the SEC insiders, the national guys, the on three men, it seemed like they believed there was a lot of smoke heading toward Auburn, too. Um, and, it sucks for Ohio State, too. You have a guy who's committed for many, many months, and all of a sudden you secured the commitment, but somehow you're number three in the potential rankings as to where these guys are going to go. But like you said, that's the name of the game, and it's today and age. It's not even just the relationship aspect of it, or when you're going to get on the field. Obviously, now we're in the NIL era, where now you're worrying about contracts and when am I going to get my money? How is this going to be dispersed? When is it going to be dispersed? So there are so many details that go on inside recruitment that the common fan just we don't have a whole lot of insight into. Um, just because it is, this is a new day and age in college football recruiting for us. So it really does feel like the early days of the wild, wild west out here in recruiting right now.
It feels like, you know what it feels like? It feels like early 2000s when bagmen were very, very prevalent, and obviously way before that, but now it's out in the open.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it feels
Yeah,
like.
right. It's a lot of people, for obvious reason, they're like, oh, Oregon's backing up the Brinks truck. They signed these recruits. Well, the reality of the situation is, if you want a lot of these high profile recruits, it doesn't matter who the program is. You are backing up that Brinks truck. You are going to be dropping what you have on it. You know what I mean? Like a Dallas Wilson's a great example, not even to Oregon or Florida. You don't think if he all of a sudden he was entertaining, let's say, a Michigan, you don't think Michigan's going to drop a bag on him
A
to try to get him
Maryland?
on campus? 100%, just like that. These programs now, that they have an extra layer to this recruitment, and they're going to use it how they can. And I think eventually, once the NIL world gets sorted out a little bit, and there becomes a little more containment as to what it looks like on a national scope, I think it's going to create a little more parity in college football. But like I said, right now where we're at, it most definitely feels like the wild, wild west of recruiting.
Let's go ahead and pay the bills real fast. We're gonna do a little bit of gambling, and then we're gonna get to the flips of Oregon today, and then maybe a little quarterback controversy. I think it is. I couldn't be very happy if I was one young man. But let's go ahead and get into it. Georgia versus Texas, 2.5 on BetUS right now with the code YouTube 150. You get 150% back on your first deposit, 125 on your second deposit, up to $2,000. What are we thinking about this SEC championship game? Essentially, you're playing for what, a bye?
100% spot on. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, SEC championship, they play that in Atlanta still,
Yep,
correct?
it is in Atlanta. Kind of
You got
definitely a
that?
home game for Georgia. I know everybody's like, "Oh, it's 6 hours away from Athens." Okay, bro, it's not Texas. So, Texas, Georgia, 2.5. I'm gonna stay away from the points on this one. I'm gonna bang money line Georgia and over a 49.5.
It's funny you say that. I was thinking money line Texas over on total points. It's Texas. It feels like, although both programs have been inconsistent,
Hard to beat a team twice.
through it is very hard to beat a team twice. Like we said, it is a de facto home game for Georgia. They have that going for them. However, I think Texas, at the end of the day, they still have a lot of firepower. I think Georgia is a defense who has, I don't want to say regress. That's not the word, because they have their games where they're coming out firing, and then they have games where you
They are very hot and cold.
100%, man. It's you never know what you're going to get, and then you get an offense like Texas, and once again, you could say the same thing about their offense. They have been very hot and cold too, given what they have on that side of the ball. However, I don't know, man. Deep in my gut, it feels like a Texas thing to me. I hope it's a Texas thing. I'm just sick of the Georgia Empire. I'm ready for that thing to crash and burn.
It
So
is
yeah,
one.
I'm gonna roll with
It
the horns today.
it is one DUI at a time. Sorry, I had to do that. Coming from a Florida fan. So, all right. Going back to what we were talking about. Go check out BetUS at betus.com. Check them out for all your gambling needs. All right. So let's talk about some flips. Nakeem Offord. We talked a little bit about him. Uh, get a quarterback out of absolutely nowhere. Jaron KS. Now you have a quarterback, Akili Smith Jr., a kid I really like. He's 198 nationally. You get essentially a 100 spot jump or a little less spot jump nationally with JKS. What was the idea here? 6'5", 200 pounds, 6'3", 210. Kind of the same play style. What's the idea here with Dan Lanning taking two quarterbacks? Actually three. One that's not on this list. But what was the Dante Moore and then they're gonna fill in with best man up after that?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what it sounds like. So, Oregon fans, they're pretty familiar with the idea that this class, this cycle in particular, we kind of knew two quarterbacks was what we were aiming for. Akili Smith Jr., we started talking about this very early on when we first started High Top Oregon. I said
Yeah.
that's the one recruit where I am very confident he's going to ride this thing out. Obviously, that kind of came to fruition today. But we did know that there was going to be a second one. They were on Husan Longstreet for a while, who else ultimately ended up signing with USC. Um, and then obviously JKS at the end here, he had come on over the last, I'd say, 2 months, where he was committed to Cal. He got a massive recruiting bump, was an Elite 11 finalist. Georgia came in hot and over the last kind of month and a half. But I really think it's just one of those things where it sounds like it's like that iron sharpens iron mentality. And I don't think this is a thing where they're bringing these guys in and trying to hold on to think everybody in that building understands what this is going to be. Something has to give. You're not going to have four starting caliber quarterbacks on your roster. Someone's going to transfer out at the end of the day, right?
Those days are done. Yeah, those days of Bama and Georgia
Oh,
holding all the 5-star quarterbacks are done.
yeah, basically what the recruitment has come to in terms of quarterback, like when you're bringing in guys like this, you're just
Are you there?
one and the other one's going to hit the portal. Yeah, and it's interesting too because the post game last week, Dan Lanning was talking about Dante Moore and kind of how they were using him sparingly this year in order to preserve that red shirt, right? So I'm like, so that tells me there's a possibility that Dante Moore is going to stick with the program for multiple years, right? And then behind him you have Austin Novosad, who I think will ultimately end up transferring out of Eugene. I think it's pretty evident that Dante Moore is the guy. And what they're bringing in, they're just cycling these guys through. So I anticipate him to transfer. That's a whole another video. But in addition, you signed another local quarterback today. You obviously have JKS out here, Akili Smith Jr. Something's got to give, And like I said, I think it's one of those things where it's like an iron sharpens iron type of thing. And if JKS comes in here and he lights the world on fire and kind of lives up to his 5-star reputation, then he'll probably be a duck and get his opportunity at the end of the day. But if anything, it kind of gives you a fail safe. If one of those guys isn't able to develop, he's probably going to end up finding the road eventually.
Yeah.
It's just the reality of where college football is at today.
And the good teams have really, really good depth at the quarterback position. We look at, I mean, you can look at 5 teams right now. Texas has Manning sitting behind Ewers. He gets banged up. A couple years ago, Alabama had depth for days at quarterback. Graham Mertz goes down, ACL. Lagway steps in. If he wasn't the true 5-star talent that he was, the season's gone. But we pick up some traction with him. Obviously, you don't want anybody to get injured. But if God forbid something happened next year to Dante Moore, at least you have some highly touted options behind him if Austin Novosad does leave.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's kind of, we see all that exact situation happening right now in Eugene, if you really think about it. Between Dylan Gabriel, when he came in, we knew he was going to be the bona fide starter. And then you bring in Dante Moore. Well, then you have an Austin Novosad who, has developed very nicely. And you can't get all these guys snaps. It's just not feasible, right? And I would say all 3 of these guys are capable of starting at a P5, well, now P4 level to some degree at some program, and it's just somebody's going to see the door. That's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah, and Austin can go to a little bit lesser program and probably go start Louisiana, a Western Kentucky, and go be
I'm
the
thinking.
guy.
I could see him going back to Baylor. He's a Texas kid. He was a longtime Baylor commit. He flipped right at the last minute to Oregon on early signing day, a couple of years ago. I could see him kind of looking in that direction. I could see like a Texas Tech being in a mix. I
UTSA.
could see like a Houston, a Houston, an SMU. I think he has the tools. He's for being a three. I don't think there are many programs who you can look at and say, if our top two quarterbacks went down, we still would be okay. I believe there would be a drop off. Don't get me wrong, but I think we would be okay if Austin Novosad had to start right now. It's Oregon has a plethora of riches right now, and it looks like Dan's trying to maintain that for years to come.
For sure. Let's go ahead and talk about Gavin Nixon. Now, IMG kid, he's ready to go. He's probably going to be an early enrollee because IMG pumps out kids that are ready to go right away. I'm going to say this. For as bad as Miami is on defense, they do have a knack of getting very, very, very elite linebackers and pass rushers. If you do flip a kid from like Gavin Nixon from Miami, he's probably on tape pretty dang good. 6 foot, 225. Out of IMG. He's playing at IMG. Starting at IMG. They play the best competition out there on the circuit. What are we feeling about him, and where did this all of a sudden come from? Because Miami felt pretty good about him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for the Oregon fans who, they do follow recruiting pretty heavily, Gavin Nix was someone who was on Oregon's radar quite a while ago. He was someone when he was getting ready to make his initial commitment, which ultimately he ended up committing to Miami. At that point, Oregon was very much in the mix, kind of committed to Miami, and it sounded like communications had died off at that point. There was another period of time over the summer where I knew they were talking to him again and they were trying to get him back on campus for an official, and it never panned out. And then it's just one of those things over the last week. It's the first time I heard his name again, and then it sounded like they hit him hot and heavy. So I have a feeling, if they were in communication, probably the duration of that, a lot of these upper echelon caliber kids, that's just kind of the reality of it. And you don't pull a kid out of IMG in Florida and get them to commit to Eugene unless they had some in-depth, extensive conversations. But one I was really excited to get, honestly, the linebacking core in this 25 class, I would say would be, once again, I don't want to use the word, a weakness in the class, but it's definitely not the strong suit of, the positions that they have recruited. So getting a Gavin Nix to, flip and ultimately sign with the Ducks, it's going to pay dividends. And I have a feeling as early signing day kind of commences, and then we ultimately approach the final signing day, I wouldn't be surprised if Oregon gets in the mix for another backer. I know they're in talks with Madsen McKay, who's another highly touted linebacker, but he's going on a 2-year mission after this. So realistically, he's a de facto 2027 commit, your recruit. So they're going to need someone else in this class, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Dan kind of hit the trail and see, who's interested, who can bite, especially in that linebacking core.
What about a transfer portal guy that didn't play, highly touted 4 or 5 star from? Listen, I'm gonna say it. Ryan Day might get fired thanks to the Ducks and Michigan after they predominantly just collapse here in the playoffs. I think that's going to happen. And if you don't think that all the college football teams are going to be like vultures on that program because they have recruited 1 and 2 nationally for the last 4 years, is that an option? Can you go in and yank a kid from Ohio State, or maybe he's got 3 years eligibility, and he or a redshirt sophomore? Is that an option?
Sure. And honestly, I won't even say it's an option. I think that's the reality of what's going to happen here. Dan has been someone who's been extremely successful in the portal over the last 2 years. He has done very, very well finishing in the top 10. In the portal, obviously, a lot of the guys that we're familiar with seeing on Saturdays, the Dylan Gabriels, the Noah Whittingtons, the Evan Stewarts of the world, the Kobe Savages, the Jabbar Muhammads, the Jordan Burt, we could go on and on. All these guys are transfer guys. And I think what Dan does a really, really good job of is obviously in recruiting, kind of setting the foundation for that program and then hitting the portal and kind of filling those holes. on the roster for who needs to come up for this next season. And Oregon, they're going to take a hit in that linebacking room come next year. Jeff Bass is gone, Bryce Betcher is gone, Justin Jacobs is gone, Devin Jackson will be back again, of course. But those are 3 out of your 4 top linebackers at that point.
That's a lot to fill.
It is a lot to fill. And, there are guys who kind of play a little bit of more of a hybrid role, like the Tatum Tuioti. He plays a little more edge, but he was a de facto linebacker as well. But like you said, we're going to have to go in and pillage somebody's linebacker. It's going to happen. There's going to be a high-profile linebacker out there that's going to hit the portal. Happens every year. This year's going to be no exception, and I really expect Dan to be hot and heavy on a lot of those top linebacking guys. And I wouldn't be surprised either to see someone kind of like you said, who has a ton of eligibility yet, who might be sitting in like an Ohio State or a Georgia or a A&M,
5-star like 2 years ago, has 4 years of eligibility, redshirt his freshman year. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. It's like, obviously the situation's a little bit different as to how it played out, but it's kind of like a Peyton Woodyard, right? The safety who, transferred from Alabama to Oregon, never saw the field at Alabama for obvious reasons. But has a ton of eligibility left. I kind of think that's what's going to happen in that linebacker room, especially now because this 25 class, I don't want to say there's no relief. There's talent there, but it's hard to look at it and say they have the guy in that linebacker room. So I think the portal is going to be realistic for Dan in that room specifically.
For as good as the recruiting is, what is the hinder on the linebacking room?
It's tough to say, and it's even tough to put it at that. Last year there was a fairly strong linebacking class that signed. Obviously Oregon's best recruiting class in school history. This year there was a bit of a regression. I think it kind of goes twofold though. Linebacker is kind of one of those positions where you don't see a lot of high school kids who are ready to play right now. Seniors in high school who are linebackers. Those are probably pretty few and far between.
The top 4 every year.
Yeah, like I said, you're that upper echelon. Those are elite caliber players, and then you have everybody else who has to develop. So unless you can get that real upper echelon, it gets really tough. And you're bringing in guys. Who's to say Gavin Nix won't come out here and be all conference linebacker someday. Devin Jackson came in, someone who's made his name felt in that Oregon linebacking room this year. When he came in, he wasn't quite the recruit that he has played up to at this point. So I don't know. Linebackers, it's a tough one. That's one where I think Oregon struggled with over the last couple of years overall. But once again, kind of like I'm saying, I feel like if you ask a lot of programs, they would say they've also struggled recruiting linebackers just because there are so few and far between those elite level linebackers. A lot of them are going to have to come into your program and sit and develop for a couple of years.
Gotcha. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Anything else that you want to talk about real fast before we wrap it up for the day? Another great class from Dan Lanning and the boys, number 4 ranked nationally. There's still a couple more days left, plus we got to get into transfer portal stuff opening up next week, I believe. So that will be something we watch. Anything left that we missed?
No, over the next couple of days, there are a few recruits who Oregon expects to be in the mix in. Obviously, I would say it's not going to be quite as exciting as today. But yeah, don't forget, we also have the late signing period too. And that's one where I think you're going to see, not even Oregon fans, Florida fans, everybody, you're going to see some names starting to pop up on your radars that you're like, yo, where did this one come from? And that's usually what happens toward that end. So, Oregon's class is looking great right now, but I have a feeling Dan's got one more surprise up his sleeve for us, and we're going to see what that looks like.
All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and close it down. I am Cody the Professor. We got Derek the Duck. Thank you. Our proud sponsor, BetUS. Go ahead and check them out, betus.com, and we will see you later. From High Top Sports Oregon, we are out.